Lone Mesa, West Texas. The autumn sky was painted with the fire of a dying day, the dusk settling across the vast, dry plains like a silent, cold, and final promise. Inside a modest log cabin perched precariously on the rim of the mesa, Rachel Garrett crouched by the hearth, coaxing a small fire to life. The wind, a lonely keening thing, hissed through the gaps in the shutters, a constant reminder of the encroaching winter and the solitude that had been her only companion for 2 long years. She wore her late husband's heavy flannel coat over her dress, the sleeves rolled up, revealing hands that were raw from chopping wood that morning. This was her penance, this self-imposed exile, a life stripped down to the bare essentials of survival. She had just added a handful of dry, fragrant juniper twigs to the struggling flame when the knock came. It wasn't the polite, familiar rap of a neighbor. It was a rapid, desperate, unfamiliar sound that spoke of a hope that was unraveling at the seams. Rachel straightened, her body going instantly rigid, every nerve on high alert. Another knock, harder this time, more insistent, the sound of a fist against unyielding wood. Her hand instinctively went to the heavy rifle leaning near the door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Then came the voice, a man's voice, not from this land of settlers, a voice cracked and pleading, torn by a desperation that transcended language. "Please, milk. My son. He is dying." She froze. The words were a ghost, an echo from a past she had tried with all her might to bury beneath the dust of this forgotten mesa. It was the same plea, the same desperate bargain for a child's life. Slowly, her hand trembling, she unbarred the heavy wooden door. There on her porch, framed by the dying, blood-red light, stood a tall Apache man. His shoulders were broad, his black hair tied back with a simple strip of leather. His eyes were dark, fierce, and unblinking, but they were also filled with a profound, soul-deep pain. In his arms, wrapped in a thin, dirty blanket, was a baby, an infant so small and still it seemed barely alive. Its mouth was dry and cracked, its eyes shut tight, its breath a series of shallow, rattling gasps that were more memory than life. A commotion from across the field, down the slope towards the small cluster of buildings that called itself a town, drew her eye. A group of her neighbors had gathered, lanterns in hand, their faces pale, fearful ovals in the gathering darkness. "It's an Apache, Rachel," one woman, Mrs. Dillard, hissed, her voice carrying on the wind, sharp and venomous. "Don't you let him in. You remember what they did at the fort. You of all people should remember." Rachel didn't move. Her training, the muscle memory of the army nurse she once was, took over. She saw past the warrior, past the fear of her neighbors, and saw only the patient. She saw the latter rungs of the baby's ribs beneath the thin blanket, the bluish, oxygen-starved tint around its lips. She saw a life guttering like a candle in a gale. She stepped forward onto the porch, her own past a roaring fire in her ears. "Give him to me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. A command born of years of tending to the dying. The warrior hesitated, his powerful arms tightening protectively around the small, fragile bundle. "I have milk," she said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth, a bitter reminder of her own empty cradle, her own profound loss. "He will die out here." With solemn, haunted eyes that seemed to see right through her to the ghosts she carried, he passed the child to her. He did it so gently, with such a profound and sorrowful reverence, it broke a piece of her heart she didn't know was still intact. Rachel brought the baby inside and sat in the rocking chair by the fire, the one she hadn't used in 2 years. With hands that moved with the sure, practiced memory of her training, she unbuttoned the front of her dress, pulled her blouse aside, and guided the baby's mouth to her breast. The child's lips fumbled weakly at first, a desperate, clumsy search. Then, with a primal instinct that defied death, they latched on. Rachel exhaled, a shaky, shuddering breath. The warmth of the infant's mouth against her skin, the gentle rhythmic pull, was a feeling so achingly familiar, so tied to her own grief it nearly undid her. Tears she didn't know she still possessed slipped down her cheeks, silent and hot, as the baby began to suckle with a growing strength. The Apache man remained kneeling just inside the doorway, unmoving, a sentinel of grief in the firelight. The flames flickered over the lines of exhaustion and pain etched into his face, over a fresh, ugly wound near his collarbone that had crusted with blood and dirt. "You saved him," he whispered, his voice raw with a gratitude that was almost painful to hear. "You saved us." Rachel didn't answer. She simply cradled the child closer, rocking ever so slightly. As she looked down at the infant, at the soft tuft of black hair, at the tiny, perfect hands that were beginning to relax, her eyes caught on something else. A piece of silver, gleaming in the firelight, tied to the warrior's wrist. It was a bracelet, or rather half of one. A heavy, hand-hammered silver cuff, intricately stamped with the powerful, distinctive design of a hawk in full flight, its wings outstretched. The bracelet had been broken cleanly, deliberately, down the middle. Her blood ran cold, her own breath hitched in her throat, a sharp, painful gasp. With a trembling hand, a hand that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else, she reached into the small, secret pocket sewn into the inside of her dress and pulled out a small, cloth-wrapped object. She unwrapped it. There, resting in her palm, was the other half of the bracelet. The exact same design, the exact same clean, deliberate break. It was the token given to her 2 years ago, pressed into her hand by a dying young Apache warrior at the Fort Davis outpost, just before it was overrun in a bloody, chaotic attack. He had been barely a man, his life bleeding out onto the dusty floor of her infirmary. "My wife. My son," he had gasped, his eyes pleading with her. "Find them. This will lead you." He had died before he could say more. She had failed him. The outpost fell, and she had fled with the other survivors, his broken promise a heavy, ceaseless weight on her soul. She looked from the piece of silver in her hand to the one on the warrior's wrist, then down at the baby nursing at her breast, a life-giving connection between two worlds of pain. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice shaking, the room suddenly tilting around her. The warrior, seeing the gleaming silver in her hand, stared, his own proud, stoic face a mask of utter disbelief. "That," he said, his voice a low, stunned rumble, "belonged to my brother. He died at the fort. He gave it to you?" "Yes," she choked out, the words tearing from her throat. "He asked me to find his family. I tried. I asked. But I was told. I thought they were all gone in the raids that followed. His wife died in the attack on our village. A moon ago," the warrior said, his voice thick with a new, raw wave of grief. "She was killed by the same man who killed my brother. But his son, they said he was taken. I have been searching for his son ever since." He looked from her face to the baby in her arms, a dawning, impossible, and world-altering understanding in his eyes. Rachel stared down at the infant, at his tiny, perfect face, at the way his eyes were beginning to flutter open, and the full, crushing, and miraculous weight of the truth descended upon her. The child she was now saving, the life she was pulling back from the brink with her own body, was the very same child she had carried as a burden of guilt for 2 long, soul-crushing years. The vow she had failed to keep had come knocking on her door, demanding its due in milk and silver. Bound by the ghost of a broken promise now made flesh, a fragile and deeply complicated alliance formed in the isolated cabin on Lone Mesa. Kyle, as the warrior was named, would not enter her home without a direct invitation. He was a man of fierce pride and profound layered grief, and he would not impose himself on the white woman who was now the sole source of his nephew's life. But every night Rachel would see him from her window. He would build a small, smokeless fire on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the cabin, a silent, unmoving silhouette against the vast, star-dusted canvas of the night sky. He was a sentinel, a protector, and she and the child, his nephew, the last of his brother's line, were now his solemn charge. Rachel, in turn, dedicated herself to the infant with a devotion that was more than just a nurse's duty. It was a desperate, all-consuming act of penance. Every moment she held him, every time he nursed, was a quiet, fervent apology to the father she had failed. She named the baby Nathaniel, a name that meant gift of God in her own tongue, a secret prayer that this impossible second chance might wash away the stain of her past failure and her crippling guilt. The small, fragile peace they had forged, a peace that existed only within the 100-yard radius of her cabin, was soon threatened by the arrival of the very man who had orchestrated their shared tragedy. Captain Thorne, a decorated and ambitious army officer with a charming smile and eyes as cold as river stones, rode into the nearby town of Harmony with a small contingent of soldiers. He was the same man who had commanded the Fort Davis outpost, the same man whose convenient scouting mission during the attack 2 years prior had always troubled Rachel. He gathered the anxious townsfolk in the saloon, a place he commanded with the easy, practiced authority of a man used to being obeyed. He told a well-crafted, heroic story, his voice ringing with false authority and righteous anger. He spoke of a savage, unprovoked Apache raid on a peaceful village, of a dangerous renegade warrior who had escaped, and of a stolen white child the warrior was now using as a shield. A monstrous, calculated lie designed to turn the fearful, isolated settlers against Kyle and Rachel and to justify his own brutal land-clearing actions. The poison of his words spread through the community like a fever. The whispers that had once followed Rachel for her reclusive grief now turned to open, righteous hostility. The townsfolk, led by the easily manipulated and blustering Amos Dillard, saw her not as a healer but as a traitor to her race, a woman bewitched by a savage. One afternoon, as she drew water from her well, a rock landed just feet from her, thrown from the cover of the nearby trees. The message was clear. She was no longer just an outcast. She was an enemy. The only voice of reason in the growing storm of fear came from the town's quiet conscience, the wise, elderly widow Miriam Quinn. One evening, ignoring the glares and muttered warnings from her neighbors, she made the long, arduous walk up to Rachel's cabin. She carried a pot of hot chicken stew, its savory aroma a defiant act of kindness in the cold, hostile air. She passed the glares of the men Amos had posted to watch the property and set the pot gently on Rachel's porch. "Fear makes people stupid, child," Miriam said, her voice dry as dust but kind as a summer rain. "You're doing what's right. A mother feeds a child. There is no law of God or man that is higher than that." Her small act of public defiance, of choosing kindness over fear, was a solitary beacon of light in the growing darkness. That night, as the stew warmed on the hearth, its comforting scent filling the small cabin, Rachel and Cale finally shared the full, ugly truth of their pasts. Kyle, speaking in his low, careful English, explained that the silver bracelet was a family heirloom, a symbol of guardianship passed down through generations. It was broken in two upon the birth of an heir, one half kept by the father, the other by the clan's chosen protector. His brother had died at Fort Davis not as a renegade, but as an army scout, a man who believed in the possibility of peace and had paid for that belief with his life. Rachel, in turn, voiced the chilling suspicion she had held for 2 long years, that the attack on Fort Davis was not a random raid at all, but an inside job, a massacre orchestrated by Captain Thorne himself to cover up his illegal gun-running activities with a local cattle baron. She had overheard whispers, seen discrepancies in the supply logs that had mysteriously vanished after the attack. She had been too afraid, too junior, and too grief-stricken to speak up then. They both realized the horrifying truth at the same time, the final, terrible piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Thorne had attacked Cale's village for the same reason he had allowed the fort to be overrun, to silence anyone who knew the truth of his corruption. The last chief of Kyle's village had been his brother's father-in-law, another man who knew of Thorne's treachery. And now, the infant Nathaniel, the last direct heir of that chief, was the last living link to Thorne's crimes. He was not just a baby, he was a witness, a symbol of a truth Thorne had tried to bury in blood and fire. The cabin was no longer a sanctuary. It was the last bastion in a war that had followed them across 2 years and 100 miles of unforgiving, blood-soaked territory. In the flickering firelight, Kyle picked up a small piece of wood and began to carve. He worked in silence, his hands sure and steady. When he was finished, he handed Rachel a small, beautifully detailed carving of a hawk, its wings spread wide in a protective embrace. It was a silent promise. They would protect the child together. The air grew colder, the days shorter, each sunset a more urgent reminder of the encroaching winter. The threat of Captain Thorne and his manipulated posse hung over the small cabin like a gathering storm cloud. The distant, flickering campfires that now dotted the landscape around the mesa each night served as a constant, silent threat. They were surrounded. It was only a matter of time before Thorne grew impatient, before his manufactured outrage boiled over into a final violent assault. "He will come at dawn," Kale said one evening, his eyes sharp as a hawk's, fixed on the distant fires. He had been tracking their movements, noting their patterns. "He will use the townsfolk as his first wave, a shield of righteous anger. He is a coward who fights with other men's courage and other men's lives." Rachel looked at the sleeping child in the cradle, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm of perfect, innocent peace. She looked at the determined, weary face of the warrior who had become his unlikely guardian. She would not let this story end in another massacre, in more blood soaking into the Texas soil. The crushing guilt of her past inaction at Fort Davis had been burned away, replaced by a fierce, unyielding resolve. She was a healer, and she knew that sometimes the most potent medicine was not meant to cure, but to neutralize. "I have a plan," she said, her voice quiet but firm, the voice of a nurse on a battlefield. "I need time. You have to buy me time." Her plan was a dangerous one, a desperate gamble that relied on her forgotten skills as an army nurse and her intimate knowledge of the local flora, a knowledge gleaned from years of solitary walks on the mesa. She spent the next day gathering herbs and roots from the hidden rocky crevices, the bitter, cloying sleep root, the calming, fragrant essence of wild chamomile, and the potent, disorienting juices of the pale, night-blooming ghost flower. She worked tirelessly, grinding and steeping, her hands moving with a focused, desperate precision. She was creating a powerful, odorless, and fast-acting sleeping agent. As the first pale gray light of dawn broke across the eastern horizon, the posse began their advance. A grim collection of Thorne's uniformed soldiers and the deputized, fearful townsfolk led by Amos Dillard, they moved up the slope towards the cabin, a wave of misguided fury. As they approached, the cabin door opened. Kyle stepped out onto the porch. He was not armed for war. He held no rifle, no knife. His hands were held open at his sides. He wore no war paint, only the broken silver cuff on his wrist, a symbol of his sacred duty. "This child is of my blood," he called out, his voice ringing with a deep ancestral authority that momentarily stopped the advance in its tracks. "He is the last son of a great chief. I am his sworn protector. This land you stand on was once ours. You are the trespassers here." It was a diversion, a magnificent, brave, and almost certainly suicidal act of defiance. As Thorne and the others were focused on the lone warrior's defiant, solitary stand, Rachel slipped out the back door, a heavy, full-water skin slung over her shoulder. She was no longer just a grieving woman. She was a soldier on a mission. She moved silently and swiftly through the brush, her knowledge of the terrain her only shield, circling around the advancing posse to their makeshift camp below. She found what she was looking for. The large communal water barrels from which the men had filled their canteens for the coming day. With a silent prayer, she emptied the entire contents of her water skin into them. The reckoning was not swift and violent, but slow, quiet, and surreal. As Kyle continued to hold their attention, challenging Thorne's authority, questioning his honor, and speaking a truth that began to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of the townsfolk, a strange lethargy began to creep over the men. First one of the soldiers yawned, then another. Rifles began to feel heavy in their hands. Amos Dillard's angry, righteous shout slurred into a confused mumble. Captain Thorne, realizing something was terribly wrong, tried to rally them, to push them forward, but his own men were beginning to slump in their saddles, their eyes heavy with an unnatural, irresistible sleep. It was at that precise moment that a new sound cut through the crisp morning air, the clear, sharp bugle call of the U.S. cavalry. A contingent of Buffalo soldiers, the respected and feared African-American Cavalry Regiment, rode into the clearing, led by a sharp-eyed, no-nonsense lieutenant. He had been secretly investigating Thorne's activities for months, acting on a quiet, coded message sent by Miriam Quinn, who had used an old Army contact from her preacher husband's past to voice her grave suspicions. Thorne, his face a mask of pure fury and disbelief as his entire posse began to literally fall asleep around him, was exposed and utterly alone. His power, a carefully constructed edifice built on a foundation of lies and intimidation, dissolved in the clear morning light. He was arrested, his career and his corrupt enterprise finished. In the aftermath, with the threat finally gone and the sleeping townsfolk beginning to stir, Kyle prepared to leave. He had found his nephew, had seen justice done for his brother. Now, he had to take the child and return to the scattered remnants of their people, to raise him as a chief, to keep their history alive. Rachel stood on the porch, her heart breaking. She had fulfilled her vow to the dying father, but now she was faced with another unbearable loss. She had saved the child, only to lose him. Kyle walked up to her, holding the sleeping Nathaniel in his arms. He looked at her, his dark, stoic eyes filled with a gratitude and a sorrow that mirrored her own. He held out his half of the silver bracelet. Then, he took her hand and gently took her half. He didn't ask her to come with him, to abandon her world for his. He knew that was not a choice he could ask her to make. Instead, he took the two broken pieces of silver, and with a quiet, decisive click, he joined them together. The silver hawk was whole again, He fastened the completed bracelet around the infant's tiny, sleeping wrist. "A child," he said, his voice soft but resonant with a new, profound certainty, "needs a mother and a protector." He looked from the baby to her, a new and hopeful future dawning in his eyes. "His home is here, with us." The story ends with the three of them, a healer who had found her courage, a warrior who had found his peace, and a child who was the living symbol of their shared future, standing together on the porch of the small cabin on Lone Mesa. They were not a family bound by blood, but one forged in the fire of a broken promise, a family made whole, finally, and completely, at peace. Of course, here is the reflection on the themes of the healer's vow and the concluding call to action for the video, written in the requested style. At its heart, the healer's vow is a profound story about atonement and the powerful, unexpected ways the universe gives us a second chance to fulfill our deepest promises. Rachel Garrett was a woman haunted by a vow she couldn't keep. She carried the weight of her failure, the memory of the dying warrior and the child she never found, like a ghost. Her retreat from the world wasn't just about grief. It was about a deep sense of personal failure. She had been given a sacred trust and had been unable to see it through. Her story is a powerful mirror for the promises we all carry in our own lives, the things we wish we had done, the words we wish we had said, the people we wish we had saved. We often believe those moments are gone forever, locked away in the past. But what Rachel's journey teaches us is that sometimes redemption doesn't come from erasing the past, but from having the courage to face it when it comes knocking on our door again, often in a form we don't recognize. The arrival of Kyle and the baby wasn't a coincidence. It was a reckoning. It was life offering her the chance not to change what happened, but to change its ending. Kyle's journey is one of finding faith in the most unlikely of places. He was a man who had every reason to hate, to distrust. His world had been destroyed by men who looked like Rachel. Yet, in his moment of ultimate desperation, he chose to trust a stranger, an enemy, because the life of a child was more important than the history of hate. His choice is a testament to the idea that true strength is not the absence of fear, but the ability to act with compassion in spite of it. The most beautiful lesson, however, is the redefinition of family. Theirs was not a family born of shared blood, but one forged in the crucible of a shared, painful history. They were three broken pieces from two different worlds brought together by a single tragic event. Yet, in their shared mission to protect an innocent child, they created something new and whole. They prove that the strongest families are not the ones we are born into, but the ones we have the courage to choose, the ones we build with vows of loyalty, protection, and a love that transcends bloodlines and old hatreds. Their story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the only way to heal our own deepest wounds is to have the courage to become the healer for someone else's. And so, on a quiet mesa in West Texas, a haunted healer and a grieving warrior fulfilled a vow made years before. They discovered that a family is not just about the blood you share, but about the promises you have the courage to keep, together. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of redemption. If this story of second chances and a love that transcends old hatred spoke to your soul, then you have found your home here at Wild West Secrets. We are committed to uncovering the tales of courage and compassion that lie hidden beneath the dust of the frontier. To help us continue this mission, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who believes in the power of healing. And if you never want to miss a secret we uncover, be sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. Now, we want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us, what do you believe was the bravest act in the story? Rachel opening her door, or Kyle choosing to trust her? Until our next story, may you have the strength to face your own past, and may you always recognize a second chance when it comes knocking. Take care out on the trail.